In 2011, a young journalist with a great post at a large TV news network became disillusioned with broadcast journalism. He saw the industry as shallow, superficial, and ratings-driven. It failed to properly hold power to account.
This was no wild goose chase.
The babies ready to jump 5 meters to the concrete. Staff worried their goose would be cooked.
And to inform the public on deeper issues. So he threw away a promising career and quit. Spectacularly letting everyone know in a savage 3,000-word blog post that went viral. That young journalist is Kai Nagata. Today, Kai is the comms director for Dogwood BC, an advocacy group that focuses on Indigenous rights and climate action, and he's still a truth seeker. And some of the things that he's uncovered are truly mind-blowing to me. The interview you're about to watch was for my deep dive on pipelines in Canada, and I hope you go watch that first if you haven't. But Kai had a lot of things to say that couldn't fit into the video essay, like the connection between the AI boom and the gas industry. We also talk about the billionaires connected to the Trump administration, how tariffs are being used to strong-arm small countries into signing long-term gas contracts, and how pipeline companies employ U.S. intelligence operatives to build pipelines in Canada. I just want to thank everyone who is supporting the Goose over on Patreon. It means a lot to me. This sort of thing is not valued, I thought, and you're proving me wrong. If you want to join the flock over on Patreon, or if you just want to join the free tier so you can get notified when things drop, I would love it if you did that. It would mean the world to me. So thank you, and without further ado, here is my interview with Kai Nagata. All right, thank you for starting your morning with me here today. Let's just start off with some basics. Can you introduce yourself and tell us about Dogwood BC?
Sure. My name is Kai. I work at Dogwood. I live on Kicksand territory in northern BC, very close to Alaska, if that helps provide a point of reference. And I am sitting about 6 kilometers from the proposed route of the Prince Rupert gas transmission pipeline. And on the other side of the Bulkley River in Wet'suwet'en territory is the Coastal GasLink pipeline. And these are the two sort of big American-owned gas export proposals that we're dealing with in this region. Dogwood has been around for 20 plus years. We work on democratic reform, Indigenous rights, and climate issues. And this is a project and a proposal that really intersects with all of those things. So that's why we've been going hard on the PRGT pipeline. And we've been trying to advocate for more than 2 decades for the people who are affected by these decisions to have a bigger say in whether proposals like this go forward. And unfortunately, we've seen more and more centralization of power and decision-making in government offices that are very, very far away and subject to, obviously, a lot of lobbying. So yeah, we try to use grassroots organizing and whatever we can do on the communications front to try to give people a voice who would have to live with the consequences of these proposals.
So one of the reasons we're told that we need to build more pipelines in Canada is to lower our reliance on the U.S. as a buyer. How would you describe U.S. involvement in Canada's oil and gas industry up until today?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the U.S. largely sees us as a polite little resource colony, and most of the time that's how we act. And when you look at the industries that are most immediately threatened by Trump's trade action and the industries that are most integrated with U.S. money and U.S. companies, it's the primary resource industries. It's the raw stuff that we take out of the ground and send to the U.S. for processing. Obviously, in the past few decades, Canada has diversified those relationships a little bit, but not enough to insulate us from the threats that we're hearing now from the States. And so that's why you see so much concern in communities that rely on the forestry industry, on oil and gas, on aluminum, on steel, on mining, because the major customer for much of that has always historically been the United States, and U.S. companies have always been deeply invested in developing Canada's resource industries. And so the oil and gas industry is no different. And the logic that's being used now in the face of the trade war is that, we need to find new dance partners, we need to find new export markets, and we need to rely less on the U.S. as a customer. But I want to stress that the U.S. is not just a customer, the US is also an owner, and the US is an investor in a lot of the industries that we're talking about. So whether we send the pipelines south across the border or west to the coast, you're still seeing heavy involvement by American companies in developing those industries, and indeed American ownership of those new proposed trade corridors, which really raises the question of how independent we would be from the US, from its richest citizens, and from its administration. And those things are all deeply intertwined.
Can you give me some examples of proposed projects that you're talking about that have heavy US involvement?
Sure. Why don't we start with one that's already built? So we've all heard of the Coastal GasLink pipeline. This is the pipeline that was forced through Wet'suwet'en territory over the objection of the indigenous people there. And it sparked police raids and solidarity protests that really captured the country's attention in 2020, like right before COVID. We had a big political crisis because all of the railroads were shut down across Canada. Ships couldn't unload, and major pressure on the federal government and the provincial government to find a solution. And then COVID arrived, and it kind of swept all of that aside, and the pipeline got built during the pandemic. So Coastal GasLink is currently the only export route to markets other than the United States for natural gas in Canada. So most of our product goes across the border to the US, but starting this summer, there will be this one terminal. And so the pipeline that's feeding that is Coastal GasLink. Coastal GasLink is majority owned by KKR, which is one of the biggest firms on Wall Street. And KKR, their founders are closely connected to Donald Trump and to the US administration. And indeed, Henry Kravis, one of the founders of KKR, was floated as Treasury Secretary by Trump in his first term. U.S. private equity will talk more about the nature of these companies, but basically, they buy up struggling companies and they apply their sort of like management magic to turn them around and then either flip them for a profit or just milk money out of them until they go bankrupt. And so KKR saw an opportunity when Coastal GasLink was facing all of these protests and it was really stalled and the project budget was starting to balloon out of control. KKR bought that and de-risked the project. And the person who I think is really worth mentioning in that story is David Petraeus, the former U.S. general and U.S. CIA director, who is now the head of KKR's internal intelligence division and oversees all of their like sensitive geopolitical investments and advises the company internally on how to deal with things like a restive native population that may not want your American company there. And of course, he brings all of this expertise from the War on Terror. He was the author of the United States Counterinsurgency Manual. And what we saw in Wet'suwet'en territory was really a classic counterinsurgency strategy like the US used in Afghanistan and Iraq, but adapted to rural Canada. And so that's the nature of the companies and the forces behind the only gas export pipeline from Canada that doesn't go to the US. So to say that the United States doesn't have influence, ownership, and control of Canada's export routes, regardless of whether they go to the US, I think is a premise that we have to re-examine.
Great. So let's go a little bit more into the CGL story. Let's just sort of, who are the cast of characters in this whole thing? If we dig a little bit deeper, let's go like before the project. Before we get to that, what was the point of this project? What is the purpose of the Coastal GasLink?
Right. So all of these gas pipelines are essentially an arbitrage opportunity for people who manage a lot of money. And so when you have a product,
can you tell me what arbitrage is? Not everyone knows what arbitrage is.
Yeah. So if bananas cost 20 cents in one jurisdiction, but people are willing to buy them for $5 in another jurisdiction, then the person who can build the banana cart to get the bananas from the cheap location to the expensive market is going to make a fuck ton of money. And so natural gas is the same idea. You have huge reserves of natural gas in North America, which have been unlocked through this technology called fracking, and we're just pulling it out of the ground faster than we can burn it. I mean, North America, don't get me wrong, the industries have tried some ridiculous ways to try to use the gas and justifying new drilling. We're now talking about powering an entire build out of AI data centers with natural gas, right? But it's still not enough. There's not enough demand on the North American continent for all the gas that we have. We want to keep pulling more fossil fuels out of the ground, and we have to be growing that industry in order to justify the investment in these drilling companies. So exporting that overseas allows the shippers and the brokers to capture the value difference between what that gas is worth in North America, where it's overabundant and there isn't enough market. Obviously, the price is very low. And then you go to other places around the Pacific where prices are higher because they don't have their own natural gas reserves and they're buying imported gas from Russia, for example. And so, 20 years ago, I think you could look at countries like Japan and South Korea and say, okay, well, they're building out these new economies. They need electricity in order to raise living standards and in order to power economic growth. So what's the cheapest, most reliable form of electricity? Well, burning gas in power plants is what's going to allow these people to keep the lights on. And, that was true a couple decades ago. It's no longer true. And those markets are saturated now as well. And so what these gas companies are looking for is developing countries with unstable electrical grids where we can convince them to sign long-term contracts to buy gas from North America to fuel their power stations. And so we're at this tipping point where a lot of developing countries are looking at the cost of wind and solar, and they're saying, well, why wouldn't we just buy the technology that allows us to generate electricity at home? Why would we buy fuel from the Americans when it's cheaper to just buy the technology to allow us to generate our own electricity? And you have these American companies backed by the American government that is now going in and saying, fuck that, no wind and solar. You're going to buy our gas, you're going to burn it, you're going to thank us for it, and you're going to pay us for many, many years to come. That's the business model. It is, shall we say, a little bit coercive. And you now have these allies, or you could call them client states like Korea and Japan, that are operating as middlemen because they don't need the gas. Their markets are saturated. And ironically, they're switching to nuclear and renewables as well. And so they're saying, we'll be the brokers for you in the Pacific. We'll help arrange, we'll open up new markets for you. And so that's really the goal of these American companies, is to find places where they can charge them more for gas than they would pay in North America. And then whoever can ship the gas from point A to point B gets to collect the difference. So that's the game. That's the whole idea. And that's why Wall Street is involved, is because these guys, they can smell an opportunity. It's basically buy low, sell high. And if you can build the infrastructure to connect those markets, then you're going to make a lot of money.
Okay, so CGL was one of those things where we need to go from the Montney play across the mountains to the LNG terminal in Kitimat. And I guess who else is involved here? So we have the U.S. government, we have KKR, we have the
TC
Canadian
Energy.
government.
So we should talk a little bit about TC Energy. So they used to be called Trans-Canada Pipelines, and it started as a Crown corporation, the Trans-Canada Pipeline. It was privatized, and TC Energy has really morphed into this kind of continent-wide intelligence/political shop, which happens to build and own pipelines. And so when you look at who is staffing TC Energy these days, it is a rogues gallery of Trump appointees and former U.S. intelligence agents, basically. These are not people that have any expertise in the oil and gas industry particularly. They have expertise in, shall we say, exercising U.S. foreign policy at home and abroad. They are people who, in one case, like Mike Waltz, the guy who started the Signal group chat and included a journalist, his wife is a vice president at TC Energy. So they have a direct line to the president through his cabinet. And she herself was a former Trump cabinet member. So there's just deep integration between this pipeline company and the Trump administration. And that has only deepened since his inauguration. And so, ostensibly they're headquartered in Calgary and in the States. They're a North America-wide transnational intelligence corporation that happens to build and own pipelines. And when you look at who is running their intelligence division, is like the former head of diplomatic security for the entire State Department. It is people who are used to protecting U.S. spies, diplomats, soldiers, and members of the executive in war zones. This is Condoleezza Rice's former head of security during the Iraq War, who now works for TC Energy trying to build pipelines through Canada. And there were leaked recordings published by the Narwhal last year that confirmed that these people see this in extremely warlike terms. I mean, they're describing their lobbying efforts in terms of like intelligence operations. You had another Trump appointee named Ed Burrier, who on a leaked recording called it successful shots fired after they convinced a bunch of bureaucrats in British Columbia not to charge them billions of dollars in compliance fees over the operating life of a pipeline. So this is, the effort that Dogwood's been engaged in for the last couple of years is to sort of help people see this in terms that actually should be fairly familiar. Like if you followed the war on terror, if you've followed the wars overseas in Afghanistan and Iraq, and you've followed what has happened with the sort of integration of U.S. companies and the U.S. government in exercising their foreign policy, it's the exact same playbook. It's the same characters. It's the same players. And it's now being applied to try to build gas pipelines through Indigenous communities in northern BC. And I think we have to understand as British Columbians and as Canadians that we are on the front lines of something fairly sinister that doesn't necessarily factor in our best interests. This is American money and the American government trying to expand the reach and guarantee the profits of American gas companies for decades to come.
Okay. So let's go into a little bit about the history of what happened after the TC Energy was sold to KKR. The Wet'suwet'en, what was the nature of the disagreement there? What was preventing it from going forward?
So the Wet'suwet'en have 5 clans, and they're one of the nations that has held on to a traditional governance system that predates colonization. And so today, like any given weekend, you can go to the Wet'suwet'en communities and bear witness to a feast in what is now a modern basketball gymnasium, but the feast hall, the institution, has been around for thousands of years. It is the place where all of these major decisions are made. It's a public forum. You could compare it to a combination of like a courthouse, a legislature, a cafeteria. It's a social institution that redistributes wealth within the community and also takes input from clan members to make these transparent public decisions about issues that affect the whole clan or the whole nation. So in the feast hall, the Wet'suwet'en clans discussed the Coastal GasLink pipeline at length and decided not to sign on. And so that decision should be final under, the governance system that's been recognized by the Canadian courts and by the Canadian government. However, the gas companies were going to take no for an answer. So the BC government, TC Energy, and turns out a bunch of private security contractors with ties to militaries all around the world went to work in order to surveil, disrupt, and ultimately pave the way for the pipeline to be forced through the territory without that consent. And they were helped in that by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and we've all seen the pictures of them storming the barricades and, pointing guns in people's faces. But those raids were really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the corporate counterinsurgency strategy that was used against the Wet'suwet'en people. And David Petraeus has a famous catchphrase from the war in Iraq where he says, "Money is ammunition." And what he means is that you can achieve military objectives without firing a single shot if you have enough American money in a suitcase, right? And a big part of his celebrated counterinsurgency strategy was premised on having unlimited American cash to hand out to essentially people who aren't willing to get with the program. So when you send a bunch of Black Hawk helicopters and the airborne jumps out and they take over a village, you're going to have meetings with the local tribal chiefs, and some of them are going to say, cool, yeah, whatever, use our village. And some of them are going to say, fuck off. And the ones that say fuck off, you can sit down with and you can say, okay, here's the suitcase full of American money. Is this enough? Is this enough? And if they're really pissed off at you, then, in Petraeus' playbook, that's when you transition to kinetic operations. That's when you go and put your night vision goggles on and kick their doors in and drag the men away or shoot them. But you can avoid a lot of that messiness if you can buy them off. And so core to the whole counterinsurgency doctrine has always been this idea that if there's, everybody has a number, everybody has a price. And so if you can figure out how much money to funnel to the right people, you can basically convince them to stop shooting at you in the context of, a hot war in Iraq or Afghanistan. In northern Canada, it's the exact same principle. The question is like, who do you need to pay and how much money do they need in order to basically try to tamp down dissent? And that is what we saw through the band council system in the lead up to Coastal GasLink construction is secret deals, lots of money on the table, and people who were forced to sign agreements that contained these ridiculous undemocratic clauses like, if any of your band members criticize the natural gas industry on Facebook, you got to crack down on them. And people felt like they had no choice, so they signed these agreements and were essentially sidelined until all you had were the traditional government who were saying, no, this is our decision, this is our territory, we have not given you consent. They did provide an alternate route to go around the most sensitive parts of the territory, but TC Energy felt like that would cost too much money, and so they said, too bad, we're calling in the cops. And they got a court injunction and sent in the RCMP, and the rest, is pretty well documented. But the underlying story of that counterinsurgency, led by a private corporation with deep roots in the military and the CIA, and the role of private security in the surveillance and intelligence gathering that fed into those RCMP operations, I think that is much less known. And that is one of the big reasons why communities in the path of the Prince Rupert gas transmission pipeline are so concerned, is because we saw what happened to the Wet'suwet'en, and we saw that these people really won't take no for an answer, and they have some pretty powerful tools at their disposal in order to try to manufacture consent.
Can we go a little bit deeper on the connection between, so we have David Petraeus and we have the RCMP, and there's like actual personnel connections between the two. What do we need to know? What's the thing that people hasn't really clocked on people's radar about this?
Well, the gold commander of the RCMP's special pipeline unit during the Wet'suwet'en raids was a former police trainer in Afghanistan under David Petraeus during the U.S. war in Afghanistan. So John Brewer, who was the RCMP commander in charge of all of the raids that we saw against the Wet'suwet'en, he worked in Afghanistan training the Afghan National Police, which was a special unit set up by the occupying U.S. government under the command of General David Petraeus. And one of the roles that the RCMP played was teaching these frontier counterinsurgency tactics to recruits to Afghan special police units. And that, I think, is just an illustration of what the RCMP is really all about, which is helping the governments of the US and Canada extend their influence around the world, regardless of what local people might have to say about that. And the tactics, the uniforms, the way that cops now all dress like they're in they're about to kick doors in Baghdad, that comes out of this war on terror and the counterinsurgency doctrine developed by Petraeus. And it's no surprise that the police in Canada, dress like the Afghan National Police and raid villages like the Afghan National Police, because we trained them, and this is our playbook, and this has been applied overseas around the world for decades, and now it's coming home.
So what does this story tell us about future pipeline projects?
Well, I think if we look big picture at the priorities of the Trump administration and who's really writing the script for Trump's executive orders and his inauguration speech, there's some very powerful figures. The media has been largely focused on the tech sector, I think, because it's novel. The idea of like all these tech billionaires attending the inauguration and Elon Musk basically taking over the Oval Office and, telling Trump what to do. That's kind of novel, but the same very powerful traditional players are still in the room. And I'm talking about the American Petroleum Institute. I'm talking about the big transnational pipeline companies like TC Energy. And I'm talking about Wall Street. And so when you look at a guy like Steven Schwartzman, he is the richest private equity billionaire on Wall Street. He is one of Trump's top 10 donors, and he's been an advisor to the president since 2016. And this is the guy who is the biggest investor behind the Western LNG terminal that's proposed on the BC coast and the Prince Rupert gas transmission pipeline. These are people who are intimately tied to the Trump administration and who are accustomed to making a lot of money off of the integration between U.S. capital and U.S. foreign policy. In other words, they are used to being at the forefront of opening up new markets and taking over infrastructure and industries in target countries and making tons of money. And so another company I'll mention is Bechtel. Bechtel was one of the contractors that was tapped by the George W. Bush administration to rebuild Iraq after the bombing campaign in 2003. Bechtel is the contractor that would be building the Prince Rupert gas transmission pipeline through contested indigenous territories in northern BC. This is their bread and butter. This is what they've done all around the world. You can look up Bechtel's role in the water war in Bolivia. But basically, the State Department and these extremely powerful globe-spanning American companies have always worked very closely together to both achieve U.S. foreign policy objectives and to make these private companies just enormous amounts of money. So Bechtel is the primary contractor on the pipeline, and the investors are some of the biggest firms on Wall Street. You have Apollo Global Management, which was founded by Leon Black, who had to step down because of his ties to Jeffrey Epstein and was replaced by Mark Rowan, who was Trump's pick for Treasury Secretary in his second term. And that is the other major investor behind the Prince Rupert gas transmission pipeline and the Western LNG terminal. I guess my point is that there is no daylight between the Trump administration's drill baby drill plan and their trade agenda, which involves what they call reducing trade deficits with these target countries all around the world. In other words, forcing developing countries to buy more fuel from America is how Trump imagines rebalancing trade, right? They need to sell these people something in order for the numbers to balance out so that old man Trump doesn't feel like they're getting ripped off. And gas is this very abundant resource that, a lot of rich people in the United States want to sell more of, regardless of the climate impacts, which we can talk about. But the fastest way to balance those trade deficits is to have developing countries buy more fuel from America. And so they are building terminals all over the US Gulf Coast, Mexico, Canada, Alaska, in order to try to send more gas off of the American continent to these developing markets. And Europe doesn't want our gas anymore. Advanced economies in Asia, like Japan and Korea, don't want our gas anymore. And so they're really focused on those smaller countries that are trying to get more electricity to power factories and economic growth. And that is countries like Bangladesh, the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam. And those are countries that Trump is threatening with these backbreaking tariffs in order to force them to buy more American products. And the product that all of these American billionaires who are funding the Trump administration, what they have to offer is gas. And that is what they're trying to push on the world, both to delay the advent of renewable energy, but also just to sell more American product into these markets overseas. And so that's what Canada is now finding itself caught up in as America's hat or the 51st state or America's resource colony. And to kid ourselves into thinking that, this is like a homegrown Canadian industry. It's like maple syrup, and we just need to find new markets for our sweet, sweet natural gas, and then everything will be fine, and the Americans will leave us alone. That's completely diluted. The oil and gas industry is fully integrated between the U.S. and Canada, and it's American companies that are pushing the big gas export projects in Canada as we speak.
So what would need to happen for us to decouple? Is that even realistic?
Well, it's
a question.
Depends
I know.
how you ask the question. No,
Yeah.
I mean, we can decouple our energy industry from the United States, but not by expanding fossil fuels. I think the ship has sailed in terms of decoupling our fossil fuel industries from the United States because they were built with American investment, and they've always been built to service the American market. And over the decades, when you look at how much of our crude oil and natural gas goes to the United States, most of the pipelines are crossing the border north-south. And uncoupling from that, finding enough markets to sell that much fossil fuel by boat overseas, I don't think we have the runway to pull that off before markets collapse completely for heavy crude and, in this case, for LNG. So, no, I don't think it's realistic to sell the amount of fossil fuel that we have to the amount that we're currently selling to the United States, to find alternate markets for all of that fuel, I don't think is realistic. But we do have an incredible opportunity to just decouple our economy and our export markets from fossil fuels. And that is the sort of tipping point that we're at in British Columbia and across Canada, is like, what is the future going to look like in terms of energy production, and what are we going to be exporting, not just to the US, but to other countries? And, we have been for many decades hewers of wood and drawers of water. We sell people raw logs and we buy back the furniture. And we have this kind of concept of ourselves that's deeply embedded in the federal government and in the provincial governments, especially, of really just being sort of a primary resource supplier to the rest of the world. And then we just buy back manufactured goods, and, we have a little surface economy on the side. But I think there's an opportunity to really Trump-proof our economy and our country by going hard on renewable energy. And you've heard some of the rhetoric in the recent federal election campaign around strengthening our east-west electrical grid, being able to trade power between different jurisdictions, to power new industries, to power advanced manufacturing, to power industries that are going to be tariff-proof from the United States, and industries that are going to allow us to diversify markets and move higher up the value chain, essentially, than just, selling raw timber or, unprocessed fossil fuels. That's been the game up until now. And I think that, as the United States reevaluates its relationship with Canada as its resource colony, it's really important that we think about what the future looks like in terms beyond just like trying to sell the same amount of coal, oil, and natural gas to other customers, because those markets are just not going to be around forever. And that's the reason why we're seeing this urgency and this push from these American companies, is that this whole strategy of like forcing the rest of the world to buy their fossil fuels from America is extremely tenuous. It might not work. And, if it doesn't work, Canada needs to have a plan B, because we'd be trying to sell into those same markets. And we need to take a really hard look at why these American billionaires would want to invest in specific industries, like in our case, LNG exports from the west coast of BC. Why is it that both of the major pipelines are American owned? Why is it that these American contractors like Bechtel are counting on building pipelines through BC? And I would suggest that letting American billionaires control our only export outlets for natural gas is not much better than not having those options at all. If they can turn the taps off in the event of a war or a deepening trade dispute, then we really don't have sovereignty over our energy exports anyway. And we need to be investing in industries that can actually be controlled by the people of Canada, rather than just continuing the decades-long pattern of letting American billionaires do what they want up here.
So Carney's rhetoric is around the idea of being conventional and renewable at the same time. It's very much the typical have it both ways liberal way. Do you see like there's an opportunity cost there? Is there something else we could be doing instead? Like you're saying, go hard on renewables, but you can't really export those unless we're talking about like hydrogen or something like that. So
yeah, I mean, the crossroads that the world is at right now in terms of energy it's really a question of fuel versus technology. So we have been living in a world where, he who controls the spice, the country that has the fossil fuel deposits and controls, how much of those are sold and at what price, those countries get extremely rich and they have outsized geopolitical influence. And so in a model where all of your energy comes from burning things, then the supplies of that fuel become really important. And you've seen the US go to war around the world to control supply chains for fossil fuels. What we have now is a totally disruptive new technology, a bunch of new technologies, which allow us to generate energy from resources like solar, wind, the hydrological cycle, moving water, tide, geothermal. These are energy sources which can be accessed almost anywhere. In fact, developing countries around the equator have a lot of renewable energy resources that are not controlled by richer countries like the United States. And so if people around the world can buy technology that allows them to generate their own energy at home from their own resources, then they don't need those supply chains of coal, oil, and gas that are controlled by American billionaires and other oligarchs around the world. If people can meet their own energy needs through a combination of efficiency and generating their own power from wind, solar, and other resources, then they don't need to be in this dependent relationship with the world's largest retailers of fossil fuels like Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the US. And we see a lot of countries opting to try to build out renewable energy instead of deepening their reliance on, frankly, despotic and unpredictable countries like Russia and the United States. And so I'm talking about Canada trying to skate to where the puck is going and apply some of our expertise in order to help improve those technologies for ourselves and for other countries. And so we would be an exporter not so much of fuel, but of technology and the expertise that goes with, like Hydro-Quebec and BC Hydro are these publicly owned corporations that generate enormous amounts of power from renewable sources. There's lots of downsides to building huge mega dams, but you can't deny that Canada has expertise in certain kinds of renewable energy. And there's a lot of countries around the world that are going to need that very quickly. And those are systems that Canadians have developed and could help to spread around the world. We could do a lot more advanced manufacturing of things like batteries and wind turbines and heat pumps. We already do a little bit, but that is the economy that I think we need to be chasing. And that is very clearly the future when you look at the EU, when you look at China, Japan, and these really big non-US markets around the world. Everybody is investing in these technologies and manufacturing capacity because it is what offers geopolitical stability, independence, and safety from the United States right now. And I think Canada needs to be a bigger part of that. We already have a lot of the expertise. We already have a lot of the workforce. And yeah, if we can figure out ways to transport some of that energy, and there are emerging technologies to do that that may show some promise, then yes, we might still also be an exporter of energy. And I think we need to remember that we are still going to be exporting energy to the United States for a long time, but we should be doing that on our terms, not at the whims of whoever's in the White House. And we should be doing more to exercise our power as a major supplier of resources that the United States desperately needs, instead of rolling over and letting Trump dictate the terms. So I don't think he has the cards. I think we have the cards, and we need to do a better job, I think, of taking responsibility on the global stage and not just sort of acting like America's little sidekick.
So you sort of hinted a little bit about how our relationship with the U.S. being either sort of like a vassal state or, decoupling, we have this weird choice. Do we have evidence that the U.S. is involved in the whole narrative to obviously they brought up the whole 51st state thing, but I'm now thinking about the Alberta separatism thing. Do we have any evidence for U.S. involvement in that, or is that something that is really truly homegrown?
I think we should take a really close look at who is really amplifying and maybe funding the separatist movement in the prairies. And I'm not coming here today with any smoking gun, but we did see a major influx of American cash, and we saw a lot of, right-wing figures in America very excited about the trucker convoy a couple of years ago in Ottawa. And I think there was lots of legitimate grievances. I mean, I was pissed off at the Trudeau government for like since before it was cool, like we've hated Trudeau in BC long before the Albertans ever did. And when I first saw the fuck Trudeau flags, I was like, right on. I mean, somebody's got to say it. And then I realized, oh, okay, it comes with all of this, right, baggage, and yeah, okay. But there were a lot of reasons that I think the trucker convoy picked up a lot of momentum and sympathy across the country. And I'm certainly not suggesting that resenting the sort of liberal arrogance and the idea of this natural governing party and the Trudeau government in particular. I'm not saying that is like needs any sort of momentum
they don't need
from
help.
foreign actors, right?
Yeah.
Like we get it. It's like that is like a legitimate domestic political grievance. However, there were figures like Elon Musk who got very, very excited. And we've seen since then that, like, through the manipulation of the Twitter X algorithm, they were serving more pro conservative content to Canadians during the recent federal election. And you can see these like American tech platforms and American billionaires really taking interest in shaping Canadian electoral outcomes. And I would be curious to see whether that transfers to the burgeoning Western separatist movement. I think we need to really keep an eye on the ties between the Trump administration, the American right, and whoever emerges to lead this Western separatist movement. I think Danielle Smith has already shown quite a few cards by going down to Mar-a-Lago and hanging out with Trump. And that ties back to the conversation around energy too, because Alberta financially is completely dependent on energy exports to the United States. And so they need to appease the administration in Washington for sure. And if there were a part of the country where you would expect to see sympathy for the U.S. annexation narrative, or a break from the rest of Canada's approach to the Trump trade war, it would naturally be in Alberta because of their heavy dependence on oil exports to the United States. When you look at the U.S. playbook in other countries around the world, and you look at what Russia did in eastern Ukraine, you look for a population that is culturally and linguistically very similar to you, and you resource them to resist their domestic government. And I hope that's not what's happening in the prairies, but the interests of a lot of American billionaires and the American government under Trump seem to align with people who would rather be part of the United States and integrated into the U.S. economy, and especially the energy market. And so I think we need to keep a really close eye on it and call it out when we see it, because there's going to be temptation by Canadian separatists to take support from American billionaires. I think we need to, like I said, I think we need to keep a really close eye on that in Canada.
So AI is sort of emerging as this new demand source for gas. I don't think this is on people's radar. So can you give us like a little primer on this?
Right. So right now there are hundreds of data centers under construction in the US, and the majority of those would be powered by natural gas. And a lot of that would be gas coming from Canada. And so we were talking a little bit about the LNG market and this idea of like trying to force American fuel on all of these developing countries that are considering whether to go with gas-fired power stations or renewables. I think LNG is still plan A for the US administration and for companies like TC Energy. And when you listen to their corporate leadership talking about opportunities in North America, they're really bullish on LNG, and they really want to be putting more gas on boats and selling it around the world. But they need to have a backup plan, because even the people who live and breathe LNG exports, they understand that there's a limited window. And so their plan B is to use as much gas as possible on the North American continent, powering data centers. And so, TC Energy is another, they're a big advocate of what they call sort of like American technological dominance. And there's this narrative that, the gas companies have been really effective in spreading, in both Ottawa and in DC, around like the rise of Chinese AI capabilities. And they are trying to create a new Cold War, essentially, where in order to maintain its global dominance in the computing sphere, America needs to be building out way more gas-fired supercomputers, basically, for military applications in particular, intelligence applications, and also industrial applications. So there is, again, a vast ocean of fossil fuel on the North American continent. You can burn that to spin turbines to power big data centers. And the idea is that we will simply outcompute other countries, especially China, if we can just frack and burn enough gas. And I think that is a nihilistic and ultimately probably doomed effort, but it could do a lot of damage in the short term. And that seems to be the direction the industry is headed if LNG doesn't pan out, which is, the signs are mounting every day that the LNG gamble isn't going to work out. And so, yeah, data centers are really the plan B.
You're really bearish, or whatever to use the finance term. You're saying that both of these things, both the AI and the LNG, are just not going to pan out. Why? What do you think that?
We saw with the release of the DeepSeek chatbot that there are ways to make this technology way more efficient. Sure, you can drive to Walmart in like a V8 diesel truck, or you could drive to Walmart on a little electric scooter, right? Like there are other ways to get from point A to point B. And I think what we're seeing is that other companies around the world have found things other than just like raw computational power in order to achieve their desired outcomes. And so the United States is relying on basically being able to outmuscle every other country in the world in this computational arms race powered by natural gas. And I just don't know if that's going to be the deciding factor in who develops the most effective and sophisticated AI tools. So that's one problem. And the other is that you just like destroy your own landscape, your water supply, you have acid rain, and you pollute the entire global climate with methane gas, which is many times more powerful than carbon dioxide. Like there's just these downsides, even if it did work out and like it played out exactly as these guys want it to, you still fuck the planet and destroy literally the ground under your feet and your own aquifers. It just seems like it's a lose-lose for people in North America, and especially in the places where these resources are extracted, where the wealth just goes pouring out of our communities. Main Street's still all cracked and broken, but you see these carpetbaggers come in and make just enormous amounts of money pulling resources out of these rural areas in North America. Yeah, we live in essentially developing world conditions, like northern BC. There's a reason why they think of us as a resource colony, or as like, just part of the developing world. That is the level of infrastructure that we're left with as the wealth leaves the territories. And we have to live with the environmental consequences of landscapes and watersheds that can no longer support the biodiversity that gave rise to these traditional governments and to the way of life that not just indigenous people, but settler families have also learned how to survive in rural areas around North America. And that is only possible if you have water that you can drink and air that you can breathe. And once that's gone, our ability to grow food and to sustain healthy communities is just going to keep slipping away. And I think that's a terrible sacrifice to make in order for a bunch of American billionaires and trillionaires to make more money frying the planet. It just seems like a bad deal. The last thing I wanted to mention is that the new generation of LNG terminals are entirely built in shipyards overseas and then floated into place. There are no Canadian workers and no Canadian steel involved in building terminals like the Cedar LNG terminal or the Western LNG terminal that's now proposed for Nisga'a territory. So when we hear that these projects are going to create a bunch of jobs and they're going to ensure our economic independence from the United States, just remember, they're not built in Canada. There's no Canadian steel workers. There's no benefits to the Canadian steel industry. There's no supply chain in Canada. It is a shipyard in Korea that is funded by American money so that Korean steelworkers can weld together modules from Korean and Chinese steel. And when all of that is assembled on a platform, then it is floated across the ocean and hooked up to an American-built, American-owned pipeline in order to take our gas and sell it overseas. British Columbia collects pennies on the dollar when it comes to natural gas royalties. We collect our little piece of the pie at the very, very beginning of the value chain, right after the gas comes out of the ground. And then essentially it just gets flipped from middleman to middleman to middleman, and the price goes up and up and up. And so the people who control the pipeline transport, they collect tolls. The people who control the tanker transport, they collect shipping fees. The brokers who then flip those cargoes to power stations in Asia, they collect their fees. So everybody's making money along the value chain, except the people that actually live on top of the resource. We get a few pennies for the resource that is being sold, for $18, $20 right now in Japan. And we have to live with the consequences of that build out and the eventual collapse of the industry. Like, all of these things are short-term opportunities. And what we've seen with the oil industry is that nobody cleans it up after they're done. Nobody cleans up all these wells. They just leak methane. And so we have to, I think, consider the sort of short-term benefits, which essentially it's our government's trying to plug fiscal holes that they created with a little bit more royalty revenue from gas. But the real money is made by the people who own the infrastructure and the people who flip those cargoes overseas. And that's not Canada. So we don't get to build the terminals. We don't get to build the pipelines. We don't get to sell the gas. We just collect these. Honestly, it's like sure, the odd turnip is going to fall off the turnip cart on its way by you, and you could pick up the turnips and be like, wow, we're rich. But don't forget, we grew the turnips. There are turnips.
Right.
And so we're in this relationship with American capital where we're like grateful for a few security jobs on a pipeline that's being built by American corporations with deep ties to the US administration. Like, sitting in an idling truck next to a porta potty is not a vision for an economic future that is going to build resilience for the long term. Like, yeah, sure. Yes, it's people need to pay their bills, and like 2 years of work on, in a support role on one of these construction projects, that is feeding families for sure in our communities up north. But we could be doing so much more long term if we actually owned the infrastructure, and if the energy industries that we were investing in actually had a future. And unfortunately, with LNG and with crude oil transport, there's just a very limited window for these things to make money. And there's a reason why it is like the sharks of Wall Street. It is the people who they're called vulture capitalists for a reason. When those guys show up, like when KKR and Apollo Global Management and Blackstone show up in your country, you're in trouble. They buy distressed assets. They buy companies that are struggling, that have a lot of debt. And they do that because they know how to make money off of collapsing industries. These are the guys who made billions of dollars off of the US subprime mortgage crisis and the housing crisis in the United States after 2008. I know I'm making myself sound very old here, but if you remember the last major financial meltdown, 2008, the people who made the most money off of that were guys like Steve Schwarzman at Blackstone, and now they own $1 trillion worth of real estate and other assets around the world, thanks in large part to riding the roller coaster and buying distressed assets when the price is low. So yeah, when these guys are the ones that are pushing new oil and gas projects in Canada, I think we need to ask ourselves really seriously, like, why? Why are all of these Wall Street billionaires suddenly so interested in this particular aspect of our economy? Why are they buying up rental housing? Why are they buying up telecoms? And why are they buying oil and gas pipelines? And if these US billionaires are, if they've successfully convinced our politicians that this is all going to be great and we've got nothing to worry about, then I think the Canadian public has to do some of their own thinking. Basically, if our politicians are too captured by lobbyists to be able to see the obvious problems with allowing the billionaires who are funding the Trump movement to own our only gas export infrastructure, then yeah, we might not be able to rely on our politicians to make sound decisions in the public interest. But we, I think, as Canadians, can still ask ourselves, why are these American billionaires trying to take over this infrastructure, and what can we do about it? And I think we still have a lot of cards to play.